Sollebarger, president of Women's City Club, and I'm glad that you've joined us tonight for a program about one of Cincinnati's most treasured assets, its park system, and how it is managed by the Park Board. Over 100 people have registered, which reflects the high level of interest in this topic. Women's City Club is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization founded in 1915 to educate, engage, and empower individuals to participate in civic life in Greater Cincinnati. We support good government and regularly present informative and free programs on civic issues. We invite you to become a member and get involved. Our park system, operated under an independent board since 1907, is consistently rated as one of the best in the country. However, several concerns have arisen lately about the Park Board and how it functions. Recently, there's been a lot of turnover in the leadership and a noticeable emphasis on development rather than preservation of green space. Burnet Woods has been something of a battleground in response to proposals for construction of various facilities in the park. This led to the founding in 2018 of Preserve Burnet Woods, a nonprofit organization created to protect and promote the nearly 90-acre Burnet Woods. Preserve Burnet Woods recently commissioned a report entitled Cincinnati's Park Board, A History, which serves as the basis for tonight's program. Our discussion will be led by David Stradling, the Zane L. Miller Professor of Urban History. In his 20 years at the University of Cincinnati, he has taught a variety of courses on urban and environmental history. David is the co-editor of Ohio Valley History and series co-editor of Urban Life, Landscape, and Policy, published by Temple University Press. He's written several books, including Cincinnati, From River City to Highway Metropolis, and Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland, with his brother, Richard Stradling. David earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 1996, and he commutes to work on foot through Burnet Woods. David will kick off the presentation and introduce our other speakers, Dr. Alyssa McClanahan, historian and historic preservation consultant, Steve Schuckman, retired superintendent and manager of the Division of Planning and Design for the Park Board, and Frank Russell, director of the UC Community Design Center and the Niehoff Urban Studio, and former Park Board member from 1994 to 2006. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for coming. Beth, I really appreciate you bringing this report to the attention of the Women's City Club, and then through the club bringing the report to the attention of the people of Cincinnati. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about some important issues. So as Beth indicated, my role tonight is to really set in context the creation of this report. Alyssa will be talking about the report itself in a little bit. So I'm going to tell a little bit of the more recent history, and she'll tell quite a bit of the more distant history of the Park Board. I should also be clear about my own role in creating the report. I'll just leave it like this, if that's all right. I'm a member of Preserve Burnet Woods. I'm on the board. I'm a founding member of the board. I'm also on the board of the Stephen Wilder Foundation, which funded the report. So I was the person that suggested to the board at Preserve Burnet Woods that we seek funding from Wilder, because Wilder does exactly this thing. It encourages the study of political issues in the city of Cincinnati with the hope of improving the way that we govern ourselves. It's the founding vision of Stephen Wilder. So before I begin and talk about the recent history, I just want to get out on the table a recognition that people do think very differently, and I think can have very honest differences about how parks should work. what their primary goal should be in a city like Cincinnati. Lots of people think of parks as being their primary recreation space, that they should be very active spaces, that it should be even a place for commerce, that these are public spaces in which the entire public should be welcome at all times. There are other people who think of parks as being less important as play spaces and more important as natural spaces. And of course, you can have both of these ideas of parks at the same time, and just think of different parks as being more likely to serve one of these roles more directly than the other. I believe that the people who joined Preserve Burnett Woods think of that park in particular as a natural space that is occupied more than just the humans that use it. I'd also like to recognize that whatever issues parks may have in the city of Cincinnati, they may not be most related to structural issues, which is what we'll talk about today, but may in fact be related most directly to a paucity of funding, which has been a chronic issue for parks, not just in the city of Cincinnati, but in cities around the world. I would also like to note, in case you don't know what the structure looks like, and Steve, who has worked at parks for decades, and Frank, who was a member of the Park Board of Commissioners, that they may add something to this. But the current structure is that we have 5 members of the Board of Park Commissioners. So there are 5 park commissioners. They're all appointed by the mayor. They serve for 6-year terms. They are staggered terms, so they don't all end at the same time. We don't get a turnover. There's no compensation for this work, although I've been told that it's a good bit of work. And I do know that some commissioners spend a lot of time engaged in park issues. And there are no qualifications necessary for being a commissioner. In other words, there's nothing written down that says that the mayor has to select a certain type of person to serve on the board. Okay, so that's the current structure. So let me go back and say a little bit about the recent history that might give you some sense, I hope, of how it is that Preserve Burnett Woods wanted to take up this study. As Beth indicated, Preserve Burnett Woods was founded in 2018, shortly after it was made public that the park board, I'm going to refer to the Board of Park Commissioners as the park board. That's I think the usual shorthand. That the park board had been in conversation with a local arts organization about the possibility of building a rather sizable building inside of Burnett Woods. This was quite alarming to lots of people who had heard nothing of it until the announcement of a meeting at the Clifton Rec Center. And it only took, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 weeks for concerned citizens to organize and to preserve Burnett Woods and create what has become a lasting organization to support that park. Well, there was some community engagement around the proposal. The arts organization came up with several different iterations of the building that they would like to have in Burnett Woods, in part responding to the concerns that they heard, and in part responding to an architect that they hired. The result of many months of contentiousness, the development of hard feelings, was a split vote at the end of 2018, with 3 of the 5 commissioners voting against accepting CCAC's proposal to build in Burnett Woods. At the very same time, they accepted a more general concept of inviting Camping and Education Foundation, another nonprofit organization with a different mission, to develop a proposal for building on the back of the existing building inside of Burnett Woods. And again, after a very, I think, contentious process, one that was perhaps more opaque than the one that led to the failed vote for the CCAC building. It turns out that that partner, the Camping and Education Foundation, was unhappy with all of the negative press that was generated by the contentiousness of the conversation, and they walked away from what had been several years of conversations about doing something in Burnett Woods. So all of this, what I think of in my reflection, I was deeply engaged in all of these things, as were other members of Preserve Burnett Woods. And thinking about the turnover in the leadership that Beth mentioned, other problems involving other parks, made us wonder if there was something peculiar going on with this current park board. I don't think it had anything to do with current park employees. There was never any sense that the people who worked for parks were part of the problem. But it had us asking, has it always been this way? In other words, is there something about city parks, the fact that people hold different ideas about what parks are for, that there will always be contentiousness about feeling ownership about, as I do for Burnett Woods, which is just up the street from me, versus thinking of parks as being belonging to the wider community, about where investment should take place, whether it be down at the riverfront or in smaller neighborhood parks or in playgrounds. In other words, is there something about parks itself that lends itself to contentiousness and I would say a rather rough go as far as community engagement? Or was there something about the way that the park board structure worked? Well, as we discussed this and I introduced the Preserve Burnett Woods to Wilder and the possibility of doing a study and to ask these deeper questions, yet a third proposal to build in Burnett Woods came to the fore, and that involved a dog park, which a very different kind of proposal for Burnett Woods, and not one that we discussed at length, but we certainly, as a group, Preserve Burnett Woods, but we certainly paid attention to the issue and watched as the park board made their selection for a spot overriding the recommendation of its staff. And once they did make that selection, hearing one of the commissioners express his fear that they would be feedbacked to death, which I think neatly summarized what I had gleaned from the way in which the park board engaged in community engagement, which is to say, usually rather reluctantly. And that perhaps the previous 2 years had not only failed the two organizations that had to propose to build in Burnett Woods, and possibly had failed Burnett Woods itself, it probably had also failed the park board, because they had grown, I think, even more suspicious of community engagement and the fact that Preserve Burnett Woods was often cast as villains in a story of community engagement. In other words, I would say that our study here was the one that Alyssa is going to talk about in a moment, was really a post-mortem on what I see as a very unfortunate and unsuccessful string of events over the last couple of years involving the park board and its interaction with the public, particularly in Uptown. And it made us ask a lot of questions about the current structure of the park board, and if there isn't something that can be done with either with the charter, with simply communicating more thoroughly with the mayor before making selections or what have you, to reflect what I think are two new realities regarding the city. And this is something that the Wilder Foundation and the charter movement that Wilder was engaged in reflect upon, is that the charter should change to reflect changing realities. And the two realities that we talked about most directly at Preserve Burnett Woods were an increasing societal recognition and understanding of the way in which structural racism limits access to leadership positions. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the vast majority of people who have served as park board commissioners have been white men, and that they have been overwhelmingly older and wealthy. Right now we have more women than men on the park board, but we have never had any kind of demographic representation that's close to the actual demographics of the city. And I'll emphasize here, because I don't think Alyssa will, that one of the structural problems may be that this is an unpaid position, and you do have to be a person of certain means and status, age, to put in that much work without compensation, right? And that's something that we learned about the problems of structures that require volunteerism, is that only certain people can. The other reality that I think is much more closer to the heart of the folks at Preserve Burnett Woods is recognizing that climate change is going to dramatically affect all places, including cities, and maybe cities more directly, and that cities should be well engaged in the process of making themselves resilient to climate change. And this is a process that needs to involve all aspects of city government, and I think Cincinnati has responded very effectively in some ways. But to my mind, the asking questions about resilience and ecological services directly related to lands that are owned by the city itself, and that includes parks, should be front and center. In other words, is there something about the urgency in responding to the threats posed by climate change that should alter the way in which we think about who is the right type of person to lead Cincinnati parks? In other words, should there be a skill set that folks who lead the park system have, in the same way that we expect, let's say, members of the Historic Conservation Board to have certain kinds of backgrounds if they want to serve. So that's my my little introduction. I hope that gives you a pretty good sense for the types of questions, concerns that we had, and the reason why we went to Wilder and got funding to engage a historian who turned out to be Alyssa McClanahan, who will be our next speaker. Let me just read to you a little bit about Alyssa. She's an independent writer and scholar. She received her PhD in history from the University of Cincinnati, and has worked as a historian and historic preservation consultant for around 10 years, mostly in downtown Cincinnati. In that role, she has worked with the Corporation for Findlay Market, the Over the Rhine Museum, Mortar Cincinnati, Women of Cincy, and other community organizations. She enjoys working with local real estate developers, managing their federal and state historic preservation tax credits, and other public incentives for historic renovation projects. Her first book is called Findlay Market of Cincinnati, A History, available at bookstores near you. So, Alyssa.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you to Beth for setting all this up. And thanks to Steve and Frank for joining and offering your expertise and experience. I'm very excited about being here tonight. So I'm going to share my screen now, make sure this works okay. All right, awesome. So as David explained, Preserve Burnett Woods and I worked together to create this history report that's available through the Wilder Foundation. And when I first met with David and Preserve Burnett Woods, they had a series of questions that they were really interested in my engagement with. And so those became guiding questions. They're listed here as Preserve Burnett Woods really sought to better understand the Park Commission's history and how it could be and operate in the future. So the report I wrote ended up covering a large swath of history. It actually started before the Independent Park Board was created, back in the mid 1800s, when our city first established parks. Went through the creation of the Independent Park Board in 1908, the codification in the city charter in the 20s, and then I went up through the recent years. So if we look at the first question that was posed to me, why was the Independent Park Board of Commissioners what we have today? Why was it created? So we should understand that the intent back then in the early 1900s was to remove the management of parks from city politics, or as one park commissioner said, to free parks from the various sundry pressures that have proven harmful. And so a lot of the reaction around 1908 was to how parks were managed in the 19th century when we began to add them following other cities. Development of parks in Cincinnati was handled by various groups of park trustees and commissioners, some of whom genuinely cared about green space, like Lincoln Park, an early park you see here. But many of the early park trustees cared only about parks near where they lived or where they were investing. They often expressed that the city had enough parks, didn't need to expand parks, that parks took valuable land from income producing purposes, that sometimes it was okay to reduce the amount of park land if the city was going through a tough economic time. And what I found was that mayors and city councilors often exhibited similar kind of casual attitudes toward parks, resulting in pretty uneven, sometimes just outright neglectful management of parks throughout the 1800s. And I found that this was the case across a lot of cities in Ohio. And so what you have in the early 1900s is this really interesting kind of statewide initiative where civic-minded community leaders from different Ohio cities got together and lobbied the state for the creation of enabling legislation for permanent independent park boards for cities that would be staffed by citizens who, while appointed by mayors, would be largely independent from city politics. And so after these kind of reformers were successful and got that enabling legislation passed, they then put it to votes in different cities. So in Cincinnati, that happened in 1908, where voters approved the Independent Park Board. And then during further reform in the 1920s, we codified it into our city charter. You can see a little bit of that language here on the slide. Initially, it was just 3 commissioners. They were, as David said, to serve without compensation for 1, 2, or 3-year terms. It was later increased to 6-year terms. And these individuals were given really important powers, broad powers of controlling and managing parks, adding land to the parks, to parkways as well, handling park finances, using both city council money that was given to them, as well as private donations. They were also in charge of levying taxes with either city council approval or through a voter referendum. So that's how the park board got set up in the first place. If we think about the next big question that was posed to me, kind of in thinking about this issue that David raised of representation and diversity, and how representative has this body been of Cincinnati's residents over time. The city charter established that the mayor was the one to appoint the different park commissioners. So in Cincinnati, the first mayor to do so was a Republican. His name was Leopold Markbright, and he appointed 3 different men, one of whom you see here, Levi Alt. Levi was a well-known businessman. He had a very profitable company that manufactured colored inks, but he was also this very passionate naturalist. You'll recognize his last name associated with Alt Park. He was a big part of the reform that got George Kessler to Cincinnati to design our citywide park system. He was a big advocate for reform that enabled us to have this independent, much more nonpartisan park board in the first place. The mayor after Markbright was a Democrat, Henry Hunt, and he filled a vacancy on the board with Erwin Krohn. Krohn Conservatory should ring a bell. he recommended Crone to the vacant position on the recommendation of Alt and some other park commissioners. Crone, like Alt, was a noted businessman, but he was also someone that really loved parks and really took an active interest in them. He was a part of that reform movement that got the park board established in the first place. And so I mention these two individuals because their early appointments really set the precedent for the park board commissioners moving forward for very much the rest of the century, and I think even into the 21st century. In that, mayors chose park commissioners because they were, on the one hand, prominent citizens. They were local citizens with well-regarded professions and reputations in business, law, and politics, people with good names. But on the other hand, they exhibited this like deep love of nature and parks and really cared about city issues. I also mentioned these early mayors and their appointments because they set the precedent where mayors received recommendations for future park commissioners from professional and business associations and circles, but also from park commissioners that were either on the board or outgoing on how best to fill future vacant spots. And I found that these practices continued for many, many years, creating groups of park commissioners that on the one hand were civic boosters who just really cared about improving their city. But on the other hand, because they're kind of coming from similar silos and circles of people, tended to be, as David mentioned, older white men, often from backgrounds of significant affluence. As you can see from some of the terms listed here, they also tended to serve for many different terms, which on the one hand speaks to their love of parks and their desire to service the city's parks, but I think it's also not terribly representative because you have kind of this consistency in leadership instead of a bit more diversity. Something that I thought was really interesting when I was working on the report was that I noticed the park commissioners, in terms of their backgrounds, shifted a little bit beginning in the 1970s. They began to include younger people, people with different professional backgrounds, and people with, I would say, like demonstrated liberal values. And a lot of this was because city council in the 1970s shifted from longstanding Republican leadership to a younger and more liberal council headed by Democrats and charterites. And as a result, city administration became more liberal. They were more interested in environmentalism, historic preservation, civil rights, feminism. I think they were more interested in listening to the public, caring about people's right to input. And so as a result, we see mayors put into the park board commissioners that kind of exhibit these traits. And I noticed that several of them were what I call activist lawyers. They were tended to be younger people, still men, but younger people that had backgrounds, giving legal counsel for the civil rights movement or for the labor movement, operating as community activists. So I thought that was a very interesting kind of transition in the Park Commission's history. But that said, the first woman on the park board is not until 1957. She's mentioned here, Eleanor Rapp Meacham. The first African-American man on the park board was in 1981, Caleb Brown Jr., who was, among other things, the former Assistant Ohio Attorney General. And I found really only at the kind of end of the 20th century did the commissioners become more diverse, with more women on the board, more persons of color receiving appointments, people of different professional backgrounds as well, some educators, community organizers. That said, I still think this is something, as David mentioned, that we struggle with this, diversity and representation on the board. And that in more recent decades, I think the composition of the board, again, has reflected the earlier decades of the board, in that many of its members are white and come from backgrounds of significant wealth, which on the one hand, there's nothing wrong with that. And it certainly doesn't discount the significant work they did for parks. But I think the point still stands that when we think about parks, which are public spaces, that we need to make sure that we have people in charge of those parks that represent the city's citizenry as a whole. So moving to the other theme here, kind of question that was posed to me, how active was the park board in setting park goals, and how unique are its recent efforts to develop Burnett Woods and other parks? I found that overwhelmingly during the park board's history, that commissioners and staff were really good, impressive stewards of green space. And I particularly loved this mid-20th century moment when I was studying the park commissioners' attitudes and actions. This is a time, as we know, when highways were going through cities, cutting through existing sections of the city. We see Fort Washington Way here in downtown. And what I found was that park commissioners were really vocal about this encroachment on green space. They called it a virus of erosion, and they referred to their efforts as this fight for survival. And it was very impressive to me. And I thought the moment very interesting. In certain times in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they worked really hard to compromise with city officials to make sure that land removed because of highways and other development was replaced with parkland elsewhere. And they tried their hardest to make sure that that didn't even happen, that the parkland wasn't displaced in the first place. I found that they were very antagonistic in the best of ways to really preserve parks. And something I write about in the report is that I think in this moment, this kind of 1950s, 60s, 70s time, we can see how park commissioners are really embracing key tenets of the growing environmental movement that emerged out of World War II, where more Americans are just critical of this idea that all development's good and that growth is always good. So like other environmentalists, park commissioners are championing the merits of open space and park preservation. And I thought it was very interesting and laudable that they very much cared about parks in the city's oldest sections as well, like the West End, then one of the poorest areas in Cincinnati, really demonstrating this idea that they cared about parks for all people. But one thing I did notice, which Burnett Woods asked me to consider, was that throughout the park board's entire existence, I noticed this tendency to want to develop certain parks, which when I say develop, I mean add recreation or commercial activity to it. And I found this was the result of two different developments. One, I found that park commissioners kind of continually expressed feeling chronically short of money. They received money through city council allocations, occasional levies, and bond issues. In the 1970s, more federal funds were available. There was also always private donations, and the Parks Foundation in the 90s added to that ability to raise private funds. But just chronic shortage of money has been an ongoing complaint that's very valid. And I noticed that, before the 70s, before that more federal money was available, this was particularly acute, and it forced the park board, I think, into difficult situations, often selling parkland at one place in order to have parkland at a place that had fewer parks and green space. And so this is what happens in Clifton in many different times, but in this moment, I'm pointing to 1949, 1950, when in a time of being really short of money, the park board sold a portion of Burnett Woods to the University of Cincinnati in exchange for almost $47,000 and several acres near Alms Park. And the park board expressed at the time that we have to really consider the city as a whole. And so I'm quoting here from Cornelius Hawk, who was on the Park Commission in that mid-century time, speaking to Clifton residents who were really upset that Burnett Woods was yet again being reduced in acreage. Hawk is saying that there are places that are in the city that need parkland, whereas Clifton has enough green space. And he regrets that he has to take parkland away from Burnett Woods, but he talks a lot about how it's this half solution, that he is in a tricky spot. And I found that that's a moment where we can be sympathetic to park commissioners, where they are pursuing these half solutions. I think in their minds, really trying their best. But I also make the point in the report that park commissioners, as much as they were a part of this environmental movement after World War II, struggled to embrace the most fundamental tenet of modern environmentalism, which is the appreciation of ecology, and that everything is connected to everything else, and that we should be wary as humans, how we develop natural spaces and how we value undeveloped or underdeveloped spaces, that it's time for humans essentially to be humble. And so I found that some park commissioners struggled to embrace that idea of ecology, and they sought to improve certain parks, definitely not as some evil scheme to hurt nature, but I think many of them in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when they pitched a lot of these ideas, I think they really believed that in a park, a restaurant or a library or an art center would be helpful to that park, would be kind of benign intrusions on nature, that they would get more people into the parks as well, which is what Park Commissioner Philip Myers is talking about here, that he's trying to maximize his efforts for all people and really get people into parks. But that doesn't jive with a growing number of Cincinnatians who don't want any kind of development within their parks, especially wood preserves like Mount Airy and Burnett Woods. And so I mentioned a couple different examples in the reports. In the early 1970s, the park board suggested a proposal that included in Burnett Woods building a restaurant, enlarging the lake, adding parking. Clifton residents and others very vocally opposed it, and the Park Commission dropped the idea. In 1984, there was an effort to relocate the Clifton Public Library branch to the corner of Clifton and Ludlow in Burnett Woods. And again, residents around the area opposed it. And same thing happened again in 1991. And so I think the recent proposals to add stuff to Burnett Woods, such as the Clifton Cultural Arts Center, aren't new or unique to our era, though I would agree with David that they seem much more frequent now. And so I think to kind of conclude on this point about development, I do think that when I studied the park commissioners in the past, I want to repeat the point that I don't think that any of their interest in developing parks was evil, or it was literally that they thought that by doing that, they were enhancing the park. And I think they just didn't quite internalize that to a growing number of people. Certain spaces don't need programming or development. And it goes back to David's point about how different people hold different views of parks. Some want it to be more active and based in recreation, and others want natural spaces, particularly woods, to remain that way. I also think these moments where the park board has suggested building in different parks showed me that they weren't necessarily great at listening to public feedback. This is something David mentioned recently. This was something I found in the 1970s as well when we talk about Burnett Woods. So lastly, something that Preserve Burnett Woods asked me to brainstorm on was a few ideas of structures for the park board moving forward. And the first idea that I want to point out is to actually not change the park board at all. And I think this is something we should consider for two reasons. One, because I found that several times in the past, voters continue to express faith in the park board structure as it was. So that's something to keep in mind. And secondly, I think because when reformers set up the park board in 1908 and codified it in the 1920s, they did do that in a way that made sure that the park board had checks and balances. So while it had control of the parks and money for the parks, commissioners were reliant on appointments from the mayor, reliant on support from city council, from having a productive relationship with different parts of city government, including the planning commission. And I think from what I saw through much of the board's history, there were productive relationships between those different parties, which I think suggests that we could leave the structure as it is. But I do think we have to acknowledge that that structure is contingent on putting great mayors and great city councilors that really care about nonpartisan parks management in power. A couple of other ideas. The second one would be to remove the independent park commission and put that function within city government. This suggestion comes because most cities that are similar sized have done this. Cleveland, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Dayton, Memphis, Knoxville had very similar histories with their park boards and decided that the most efficient nonpartisan thing would be to put it within city government. So that's one idea. Another idea is to keep it, but change its structure a little bit. Some cities have taken their independent park boards and made them into advisory councils where the park board, where the advisory council members don't control money for the parks, but these are technical professionals, scientists, horticulturalists, engineers that advise city council on best practices. So Knoxville, Memphis, Denver, Albuquerque, Fort Worth, those are a couple cities that have done such things. So that's a possibility. And again, these are all just suggestions that we can comment on. I am by no means an expert in how to structure this. Another idea would be, again, to just restructure membership requirements, which David mentioned. One idea could be to have one city official sit on the park board, such as the city manager. Another idea could be to change the charter so that certain technical requirements exist for park commissioners, like historic conservation board appointments. So for the park board, it could be you have to have one engineer on staff, you have to have one ecologist on staff, on the board, and so on, to try to make it full of people with technical experience. Relatedly, it could be that you have to demonstrate specific volunteer experience related to parks, both board appointed and non-board appointed appointments, to really show that you care about conservation and nature. Another idea I had was to, if you're not going to specify technical professional requirements, perhaps you could require professional diversity on it. So you have a parent sitting on it, you have a community organizer, you have a business person, just to kind of get a range of perspectives, really better representing a variety of Cincinnatians. Something that other cities have done is to institute strict term limits, which could be something that we do. And lastly, we could think about who appoints the commissioners in the first place. It seemed very common to me when I studied other cities that it wasn't just mayors appointing park commissioners, but it was a mayor appointing one or two park commissioners, and then a city manager appointing the other one, a school board representative appointing another one. So we could diversify who picks who to be on the board to better encourage diversity and genuine representation of the city. Okay, so that is my presentation. I'm going to stop my share and hand it back over to
Thanks, Alyssa. That was great. I should mention that if you want to read the entirety of Alyssa's report, you can find it at Preserve Burnet Woods. You can just Google Preserve Burnet Woods, or more specifically, Preserve Burnet Woods Wilder, and you'll find it. And you'll also find a shorter executive summary, which would give you the highlights. Next up will be Steve Schuckman, retired in 2021 after working for the city of Cincinnati for 42 years. He has a background in architecture, urban design, planning, and parks administration. He worked in historic preservation and neighborhood planning in the Cincinnati Planning Department from 1979 to 1990, and he was the author of the 1990 Uptown Plan. From 1990 to 2021, Schuckman directed planning, design, and construction for the Cincinnati Park Board. He is the author of the 1992 and 2007 park master plans and directed the design of such award-winning parks as Washington Park, Friendship Park, and Smale Riverfront Park, all of which I think are extraordinarily successful. That's a little editorializing. Sorry, Steve. Steve managed a wide range of park and facility renovations, an investment of over $220 million in the city's park system. He also managed facility maintenance and restoration of the system's historic buildings and infrastructure, as well as parks property transactions. He was the interim director of parks from 1999 to 2000 and initiated numerous innovative park projects, working with donors, public agencies, and community and park stakeholders. So thank you for coming, Steve.
Thanks for having me. And who wrote that? Jane?
I didn't write it.
Well, I'd like to make some general comments. I certainly want to leave room after I've commented, and Frank for questions and answers. And thanks for having me as part of this. I've read the study, as you'd imagine, with great interest. A few comments. One is in terms of changes to the park board structure. I think it's absolutely essential in my experience that the park board remains an independent board. If it were to become a city department, or even if it was to become advisory, I just think that the city would lose a wonderful asset. I think we've got the over 5,000 acre system we have today because it's been under the control and management of an independent board. Future mayors and city councils and managers could determine in the future, if there wasn't an independent board, that there'd be a better use for park space. And we've seen it before, to convert to, say, a school or for housing or other credible uses. But the focus would be the preservation of parks just wouldn't be the same. And I think we'd have less of a park system today. I know some cities such as Pittsburgh, when they got rid of their independent commission and made parks just a city department, parks and park funding fell apart. And the only thing that saved Pittsburgh parks was the Pittsburgh Conservancy. So to me, there's a strong argument to retain the independence of the park board. That's not to say that some of the changes that are suggested here are bad changes. I think, in fact, similar to the Historic Conservation Board and to the Park Board's own Urban Forestry Board, that commission slots could be changed to be specific kinds of qualifications. For instance, that a commissioner should be an environmental scientist or an ecologist, an urban planner, a landscape architect, a horticulturist, a community representative. And I think that that would be valuable. I also think, as part of the independence of the board and for the board to be perhaps more diverse and less politically motivated in some ways, that the appointments to the board, instead of coming from the mayor, I think it might be interesting to look at other alternatives, such as appointments by the city manager with confirmation by city council, with recommendations for who should be on the board to come from the park board, from park professionals, and from others in the community. So I think that could be a good change to consider. I think no matter what structure you have, and you can see through the history of the park commissioners in the past, it comes down to largely who is it that's going to be appointed. But again, to have a different structure in the way those appointments are made, to have specific seats on the board, I think could help. I'm not sure in expanding the diversity of boards and who's on them citywide, if there should be some kind of commission or committee to inform the city manager. And I'd be curious to know what other cities do to pick their board members. A comment I will make, though, about the study in general, and some of the comments I've heard from you and from Alyssa, are that there's kind of a sense that development with a capital D is a bad word. And to me, it's not really the case. It's a matter of what we mean by development, what the scope of it is, what the intent of it is. That I think parks and green space, as Will Rogers said, they don't make land anymore. Absolutely, it needs to be preserved and conserved, needs to be sustained, but parks are also for people. So we need those public restrooms, we need those picnic shelters and playgrounds. In the case of the riverfront, from Friendship Park to Smale, new parks. and parks to respond to the needs of the community today. And that's something that I think that we've always done in terms of lots of development proposals in parks. In my 32 years with parks, I haven't seen that except just in the last few years. And yes, there have been a number of proposals in Burnet Woods. I think community participation is essential. And again, in my experience, when we made any major changes in parks, when we designed new parks, we did lots and lots of community engagement. And we had public meetings, even when it came to the proposals for Burnet Woods. And I remember one very well-attended session in the Quarryville Community Center, Recreation Center, because people were very passionate about parks, and particularly in this community. And I live just a few blocks from Burnet Woods too, so I could say this community of Clifton, people are very passionate about Burnet Woods. And as you'll read in the report, and many of you know who are watching this, Burnet Woods used to be twice as large, and the university took more and more of the park. And yeah, the park board in prior years was part of that. But I think our approach has always been parks are not for sale, and there are just a few limited circumstances where it made some sense to do some transactions, and those transactions happen with community support. I think parks, it's so much a balancing act, just like I don't think parks are about making money, but it's always been a balance of fee and free activities, that there's never been enough money for operating costs coming from city council. So parks does need to generate some income, not by selling land, but by charging, for instance, at Crone is one way to make money. I think it's also a balancing act between preservation, I come from a preservation background, and serving the community. And those community needs have changed over time, but it's still a place for recreation. It's a place for enjoyment. And it's a place for nature. I don't want to go over my allotted time, so I think I'll stop there. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. Our next participant is Frank Russell. He's the director of the University of Cincinnati Community Design Center and the Niehoff Urban Studio, and is adjunct associate professor of practice in planning and urban design. He is a registered architect and urban designer. Frank has served as the commissioner of the Cincinnati Park Board and the Cincinnati Recreation Commission, and as past chair of the Urban Design Committee of AIA Cincinnati. He has been a trustee of the Cincinnati Zoo, the Mercantile Library, the Mill Creek Restoration Project, Gabriel's Place, the Center for Closing the Health Gap, and the Over the Rhine Foundation. Frank has been a committee member for the Downtown Cincinnati Incorporated, the Uptown Consortium, the Port Authority of Greater Cincinnati, Agenda 360, the Greater Cincinnati Food Policy Council, the City of Cincinnati Food Access Task Force, and the City of Cincinnati Healthy Living Task Force. Thank you for joining us, Frank.
Thank you. The topic is fascinating and close to my heart because my specialty is urban design. So I concern myself with the structure of the city and the urbanism that we experience and enjoy. And that was my connection to the park board, is that understanding that 10% of the land of the city is in parks. And that component itself makes the park and the open space and the naturalized spaces and the more structured green spaces part of the urban environment, part of the urban context. So that was always my interest. And I was not so much interested in the politics of how the board worked. And I think that, you know, this event is ultimately trying to reach a pragmatic outcome, some judgment as to what the structure of the park board should be, how it should be changed to some extent. I think that I'll make a couple of remarks on that, and then I'd like to talk about a bigger overarching issue, which I think comes out of your effort here. I would agree with Steve that I think it's important that the park board remain independent to the extent that it can be, understanding that the representativeness of the composition has evolved over the years to become perhaps somewhat more representative in terms of the demographic profile that we see in the city. But I would say that it has, and when the composition is described as becoming a bit more composed of activists, people that are concerned about community issues and things of that nature, as well as becoming more diverse racially. It's an interesting observation, but I would maintain that the underlying structure is essentially the same, which is these are individuals which, because they're appointed by the mayor, are concerned with getting the mayor reelected in one way or the other, or vice versa. Those people that the mayor see are potentially concerned with and able to help that person get reelected. Whether it is through financial contributions directly, as we would expect, or whether it is by corralling an interest group. One of my favorite partner commissioners was Roscoe Fultz, African-American gentleman from Avondale, and he would let you know pretty clearly that he could corral multiple precincts in Avondale. And he didn't bring funding to the campaign chest, but he brought a lot of political clout. So these things are expectations of the mayor in his appointments. So, and the young lawyers that you described, they're political activists. They're very active in the party, and they will have an impact, on the mayor's political standing within the party, maybe even within the state. So this hasn't changed. I mean, I think this is the constant. All roads lead to the mayor. When you talk about the ability of a city manager to participate on the board, either personally or maybe they are appointing staff to participate on the board, I would give you the same answer, which is all roads lead to the mayor. We know that the city manager, while on paper doesn't serve at the pleasure of the mayor, essentially serves at the pleasure of the mayor. And the mayor has tremendous influence over what the city manager does in our current environment. And you see this playing out every day in development deals and incentives that are occurring throughout the city. In particular, I see Over the Rhine as sort of a laboratory of that activity. So I would agree that the mayor has undue influence over the outcome of the board and the composition, of course, but I would not suggest that the city manager would be any more impartial. I think he or she is a creature of the mayor's whim as well. So I would caution you about that. I would also add that the park board is not and never has been, I don't believe, a working board. They have been an oversight board. They're not composed of experts because the park board staff is composed of real experts. Steve Schuckman, the landscape architects, the horticulturalists are very distinguished in their various specialties. And pragmatically, there's no need for the board members to duplicate that expertise. But providing oversight, I think, is the primary function of the board historically. And I think that that's a valuable component. So I'm not advocating, having city staff or city manager participation. There's nothing wrong with having expertise on the board. I don't think it's critical because of the staff that we have, which I think will continue to be highly specialized professional staff. I don't know the answer, but I think that those two directions I don't think will be fruitful. I want to sort of go big picture here and talk about some of the an overarching issue that I hear. I mean, your study and some of the themes that I hear come out of a concern, alarm, and disgruntlement about how ecological resources and assets have been managed by the park board, to the extent that they have or have not, or have been impinged upon or infringed upon. And I think there's a fundamental ambiguity about what we mean by nature, ecological systems. Historians might appreciate this, we'll see. So if we go back in time here and think about how the great Germans, the good Germans managed the public space of our city, you will note that there was only one public park, and that was Lincoln Park. There were no other public green spaces, and that green space was pretty well sculpted. You wouldn't even recognize it as a green space. It's a bit more of a place for people to promenade. There was a green space that was thought to be donated, the Piatt Park, but that was originally intended to be a market space. So despite our incredible density in the basin and over the Rhine West End, there were hardly any green spaces set aside. Washington Park was a cemetery, only converted to a park later on. The good Germans were extremely pragmatic about how they dealt with public space and felt like it all should be directed towards economic value. And I submit to you that that has been our attitude that has persisted throughout. So when we as Cincinnatians think about space, we think about how it could be used in its highest and best form. I think for us, Cincinnatians, we think about that as being productive. So when we think about Burnet Woods being cut up for the University of Cincinnati, we're thinking about how these institutions can be framed within a green network, and how those institutions can function more effectively and in their proper form in that green landscape. We don't think about, preserving each tree. We think about how those the functionality of the institutions are enhanced by the green space. When we think about the Kessler Plan, 1907, we look at the plan and think about how wonderful it was that they set apart or defined these large green areas. But then you look at the green network that connects them. That was all about automobiles and parkways that automobiles could travel on to enhance the mobility within the city. So I would submit to you that the way that we think about green space is not in the ecological sense that I hear being described in the report. It is about the functionality. And until a narrative is generated about the benefits, maybe financial, certainly health benefits, about green spaces that are set aside in untouched form, I don't think it will join the historical understanding of how we address green space in Cincinnati and the urban environment. So I think there's an overarching issue which hasn't been addressed. How we bring these different ways of thinking about green space and the ecological benefits and assets together to serve different viewpoints on those assets.
Thank you, Frank. Maybe I'll just, would you mind, Beth, if I just make a comment on something? Frank, I hear you as far as, the difference between an oversight board and a working board. I think part of the problem, and we may have had somebody comment on that, is that that our oversight board has all of the authority of a working board. And so when they don't agree with the recommendations of staff, they can ignore them. And when they really disagree with staff, they can fire them. And I think that that sets up a, you know, a dynamic that allows for some mischief. But I also think that my point about expertise, or Melissa's point about expertise on the park board, in other words, not just having somebody who is, you know, a friend of the mayor, or somebody who can get, I think you put that very, very well, Frank, about, you know, the way in which these appointees are political in all of the senses of that word, is that people who have a required expertise would not necessarily then be challenging the detailed work of the employees. That wouldn't be the point of the expertise, but it would be about making certain that people have a certain way of thinking, that a certain horizon of concern are members of the board. I think very many of the board members in recent years have been from a business background, which is great as far as managing a tight budget, but it may encourage a much shorter time horizon as far as thinking about management is concerned, because business people have a much shorter horizon usually than say ecologists or historians would, as far as thinking about you know, when do solutions need to be implemented, and how permanent various solutions may be. So I can't remember, Beth, how we decided we were going to do questions and answers. Are you?
I think we agreed that that I could read the questions, and they're mostly in the chat, actually. And there's quite a few comments, and I'll try to be judicious. One question is, does anybody approve the mayor's appointees to the park board? Presently, it seems that it's comprised of friends and contributors to the mayor.
City council has to confirm whoever
Does
the
it?
mayor nominates. Yeah.
It's a simple
Okay.
majority, Steve.
Excuse me?
Simple majority vote.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see.
While you're doing that,
Okay.
Beth, let me
Yeah.
just comment on
Yeah.
something that Frank said that made me remember that Mount Airy Forest is a man-made forest. When we talk about changes in the system and what constitutes development, that was, we planted, no, I wasn't there at the time, but 1911, 1912, over 1 million trees were planted and what was eroded farmland to create what looks like today's nature in a natural state.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty amazing.
But Steve, you were around when Adolf Strauch resculpted Burnet Woods. And
Yeah, thanks, Frank.
made that from what, just a couple of you know, a wasteland into a beautiful picturesque park.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Cynthia Duval commented, when we talk about meeting the needs of people through our parks, the park styling needs to allow for diversity of needs. Some need more developed parks and some need more natural parks. The current board's trend has been to move towards singular styling of parks. Not everything should be Smale or Washington Park. Not everything should be Mount Airy. There has to be equity and balance and diversity across the styling of our public green spaces. Any comment?
I agree.
Ooh, I've got a good one for that. I was really sort of unhappy about how some of the riverfront parks were ending up. They were so full of bling and what I would call gewgaw. You know, every little bell and whistle that you could fit in there, swings and all these things that were getting in the way of trees and just passive green space. But people love them. People love those things. So, you know, everybody's understanding of what green space is going back to the natural systems as well, but and how it should be used is so diverse. But one thing that Steve did, that I did learn from Steve, among the many things that I retained, was that we do have a hierarchy of parks. You know, we have pocket parks, we have neighborhood parks, we have district or regional parks. And here's where some of the conflict with Burnett Woods comes in, because it is perceived by the park board and I think the staff as a regional park serving the entire Uptown region and maybe even slightly beyond that. And that in some sense makes it required to be available for many different interests, not those who just surround the park. And that sometimes can be a big conflict.
Yeah, I would say about Burnett Woods that of all the nature centers in the park system, the only nature center that's in an urban park is Trailside. And with the lake, the man-made lake and Trailside and the trails, it's also a park with the bandstand and with playgrounds and with shelters. So it's pretty unusual compared to other parks. It's a neighborhood park, but it serves many neighborhoods and in some portion entire cities, as I said, Frank. So it's been an interesting experience dealing with those 90 acres and trying to achieve the right balance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a question from Carolyn Miller, who asks, who should appoint the director of parks?
Well, under the current charter, just for everybody, the director of parks acts like a department head, but is not appointed by or under the control of the city manager. So officially in the charter, the director of parks is the secretary. It's called the secretary to the park board. So the park board hires the park director under the current system. And the administration of parks is carried out by the park director and his or her staff. As Frank said, so it's a professional staff. They're all city employees, but they are part of the park board under the policy board of the 5 citizens who are appointed to be commissioners. As Frank said, they're largely, and in my experience has been in the past, a policy oversight board. They approve the budget, they approve grants and grant requests, and give general direction and set priorities, but generally will follow professional staff.
Okay, here's a comment from Bob Bergstein. This is the first of several points I would like to make about the current park board. As far as I can tell, no one on the current board is particularly knowledgeable about conservation or natural history. No one has the preservation of natural areas as a prime concern. No one seems aware that natural areas require funds to maintain the natural diversity of plants and animals, and that natural areas have been underfunded and poorly maintained for at least 20 years. As it is now well known that natural areas are important for all people of all parts of our society for enjoyment and mental health. So that relates to the idea of having areas of expertise designated for the board.
Well, that I would comment on that as well, saying I think that here I still will maintain that I think a narrative needs to be generated here that can better communicate the value of that natural area, because it's easy to talk. It's easier to talk about the value and impact of, I'm just going to say it, a cafe on the lake in Burnett Woods. You know, we can calculate that. We can see it, you know, maybe in terms of what we see in other places, European parks, for example. But it's very hard to quantify and then prove the value of these natural spaces. And I think that's naturalized spaces. And I think that that's what needs to occur for this narrative, for this report to move further and have a greater impact on the way park board commissioners and everybody understands park space.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we've had a perpetual problem of underfunding, and Bill Collins has a possible solution for this. He says the real question is, how can we restructure parks and recreation so that we can win a renewable levy to finance this? In November 2021, a majority of city voters voted yes on the Great Parks, the county levy. The city vote put the countywide vote total for Great Parks over 50%. Without the city vote, Great Parks would have failed, even though city residents have less convenient access to the county parks than people who live in the burbs. Clearly, there's an opportunity to pass a levy for city parks, but we cannot keep the park board unchanged if we are serious about passing a levy to make parks, recreation, and trails a real priority in the city. So what about the concept of creating sort of a joint levy between parks and recreation?
I'll start with that. And I think it's unfortunate that the levy that the former mayor promoted came out the way it did, with no public input, with really very little input frankly, from parks, and went down in flames. And that kind of gave that a bad name. There's been discussion over the years about a potential for a Cincinnati Park and Recreation levy, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And as Alyssa said in her history, you'll see that a number of park levies were overwhelmingly passed in Cincinnati in the past. So that's certainly one potential revenue source. Another one, it was recommended in the 2007 master plan, and a number of cities do this, is to have a designated percentage of the city's fund, general fund, that goes to parks or parks and rec every year. And I read recently that in New York City, they're looking at designated 1% of the general fund to parks in the city of New York, as well as planting another 1 million trees. So whether it's a designated funding source, what gets over the hump of fighting for the budget every single year, that you kind of know what your budget is, or possibly a potential levy in the future, along with being proactive, looking for grants, working with the foundation for donations, doing partnerships, those seem to be all the ways probably combined to try to solve this funding problem that our park system has, as so many park systems have across the country.
Okay, thank you. Dot Christian asks, how can the parks allow a riverfront marina, which will be used by very few people, and clutter up the riverfront?
Well, I guess it's a matter of opinion about clutter. A marine, there used to be a marina there for years that Recreation ran. It's been in the 92 and the 2007 master plan to have a marina. Yes, it certainly, I think the rationale is it serves a much smaller group, but it's just one more group of people to serve, to bring downtown, to bring to the river and the banks and downtown, and provide an amenity, and to hopefully to make some money on that. And I'm not sure where the current project stands. It's my understanding that the park board has agreed to negotiate with one particular developer to build a marina, more or less where the old marina used to be.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. Emma asks, how can we be effective advocates for parks we feel need more attention and funding but aren't getting it, like Mount Airy Forest?
I think I could take that up. I think that's a wonderful question, because one of the things that we all realized when we created Preserve Burnett Woods is that we were really stepping into empty space, that there was not a community organization that served to provide feedback to parks employees or to the park board itself about our thoughts, our interests, to focus our energies, our volunteer effort to improve the park. There was no organization that would allow us to show up on Saturday afternoons and do work in the park, to develop a relationship, a successful relationship with the park board, so that all of that positive energy could be put to good use and to improve the park. And so I really do think to create a Friends of Mount Airy or Friends of whatever park, I think that really is a wonderful first step. Steve mentioned a conservancy, and really I was thinking when we started to create Preserve Burnett Woods about the most successful of these organizations, which is the Central Park Conservancy in New York City, which has remarkable, because it is so successful, has remarkable control over that public space. And again, because it is so successful and at raising money, make certain that that park will never deteriorate back to the way it was when the Conservancy was first created.
But can I add to that, David, and I applaud what Burnett Woods has done and the people who are out there promoting programs and doing bird watching and dealing with honeysuckle and everything else. But I do have to point out that the park board has over 24 park advisory councils, and some are more active than others, but they exist because of the people's love for and advocacy for the parks that they go to. And unlike community councils, park advisory councils are open to anyone who cares about the parks or crosses neighborhood boundaries. And in the past, the park board has certainly consulted advisory councils. And it's a two-way street. What do advisory councils want to see in their parks, and how do they feel about proposals the park board's brought forward? So that structure is already in place.
Yeah, we decided to operate outside of the advisory council structure, in part because the Burnett Woods Advisory Council was essentially more abundant, but also at the time, it isn't any longer. It has also been reactivated. There are some, as you said, they're really successful. Obviously, Alt Park has used its advisory council in a way that helps it feel very different than most city parks, right? The level of community engagement with that space and the way in which they manage a vision for that park is quite remarkable. There aren't, to my mind, there aren't any others that are nearly as engaged as that. Maybe you know.
Well, I would disagree a little bit. I think about Cuff. I think about Kennedy Heights. I think about Mount Echo. Stanberry certainly. Some have been more successful than others in raising money, but in making their needs known, in organizing their own communities and working with parks. There are many advisory councils that are in fact pretty successful.
And I'd like to add one thing on that as well. I think if you think about the various leadership dimensions that could occur within the park board and all of its activity, and think about it as an ecosystem, the board is oversight, political clout, right? Being able to push back against, in its best outcome, pressures that may be contrary to what may be perceived as best interest for the park. You think about at the very other end of the spectrum, you've got, the neighborhood advisory councils, but in between, you've got other sort of larger scope advisory boards. One would be that exists is the Urban Forestry Advisory Board, which has a tremendous impact on the city. Now, I know it's not as active. It's been more active in the past, but think about the impact of that board. Was created by somebody who was just an activist. Pope Coleman, I think, got involved with that in the 80s, I want to say, I'm not sure. And it led to this citywide effort, Urban Forestry Division of the Park Board, right, Steve? And that it has an advisory board. Now, why couldn't we have an ecosystem advisory board, a natural spaces advisory board that would really either they would be a working board as the Urban Forestry Board is, and also apply pressure and inform and educate the park board commissioners about specific issues.
That's an interesting concept, and I could see where that might get to be complicated. Lots of boards, sort of all these special interest groups, but that might be something to explore. A number of other advisory groups that are advisory to the Board of Park Commissioners, but those groups then would be able to work more closely with park staff. It's interesting.
Okay, good. We have two questions about how the park board gets feedback from the public. what would it take to get regular and productive communication between the park board and knowledgeable park staff to ensure their expertise and passion is better utilized than it is currently? Oh, that's not about the public. That's about the relationship between the park board and the staff.
Well, Steve, I'm laughing because Steve and I are both architects. And so, and me being a board member, Steve would, every time we'd be at a public event, Steve would say, "Oh yeah, let me introduce you to Frank Russell. He's a commissioner, he's my boss." That never occurred in real life. Steve and the professional staff, I hope I'm answering this question correctly. They have well more expertise than anybody in the commissioner's role, as they should. And it's important for us to support them. We're really just the part-time help, helping where we can. I think that, but there's a role, and we can be educated by staff. Commissioners can be educated by staff if they're not too busy doing what they need to do to get everything done, with what's on the agenda. But I think there does need to be a division. The director is the buffer between, the staff and the commissioners. But really, I mean, the staff is the heart and soul of the park board. The commissioners are just part-time help.
That's hard to argue with. Here's a comment from Bob Highland. Prospective park board commissioners and management level staff should be required to earn a certificate in community engagement. The equating here tonight of public meetings with community engagement is a gross misunderstanding of best practices in community engagement. When 85+% of a public meeting's attendees voice opposition to a development, but the park board and staff proceed with that development proposal, that isn't community engagement. It's ignoring and dishonoring the community. I don't know if he has some specific thing in mind. I think Lytle Park is maybe an example.
Well, I didn't mean to imply that public meetings were the only means of engagement and the only means of engagement that we used in the past. And there are more and more and better means of engagement. I know we've done a number of surveys and just talking to people on the site, and particularly engaging with community organizations, with the neighborhood council, with advisory councils. That's all part of what should happen. The city as a whole, it's supposed to be launching or has launched more community engagement sessions. And I don't know where that's gone, but I believe that there was an administrative regulation that the city manager issued to deal with people learning to do community engagement and doing that. And I don't know where that stands, but somebody could look that up, that the city as a whole, at least city government, has begun to look at that in a more systematic way.
Okay, very important. Are there or should there be any zoning requirements for certain proposed parks changes? Developments in parks can have traffic, parking, noise, etc. consequences. Should another board like the city's zoning board have a second layer of oversight for any significant use changes?
Well, I wouldn't think so, but any changes in land use, for instance, to change a site that's zoned for one use to a park has to go through the planning commission. So that's the second check. Just like every time that public art is placed in a park, if it's new art, that also has to go through the planning commission. So you've got two different citizen boards that review that, as well as their staffs.
The park property park use didn't have its own zoning designation until recently.
Yeah, I mean, relatively recently, the Park and Recreation Zone, but no one really is involved in what happens. No other board is involved in what happens within parkland other than the park board itself. When it comes to selling or leasing parkland, certainly that also has to go through the Planning Commission and City Council.
Okay. It's after 8:30. There's so many questions. I don't know if we're going to be able to answer them. Jan Brown-Checo asks, Steve, can you talk about the financial benefit that including the Moorline Logger House in the plans brought to the Riverfront Park?
Well, as Frank actually alluded to, there are many parks in the world that have restaurants or cafes or beer gardens. And when we were developing the plans for Smale Riverfront Park, which before the wonderful contribution of the Smales was just called Central Riverfront Park, we'd always considered putting a restaurant there, both to have a restaurant in the park and the wonderful service it provides to be able to eat or drink in a restaurant in a park and outdoors in a park, but also to generate revenue for the park. So when the park was designed, it was certainly designed to have a restaurant in it. And that restaurant has proved to be not just popular and a draw to bring people down to Smale and to the banks and to the river, but also generates significant revenue for parks. And that constituted a multi-million-dollar private investment to build that restaurant. So there aren't many examples of that, but it seemed to us, and it was a plan that was vetted with the community that from the beginning looked at having that. And when I talk about a balance of uses and balance of free and fee, we've got many picnic shelters that are free, but other ones you pay to rent. And this one pays us, Moorline pays some significant rent to parks, which certainly goes totally to the maintenance of the park. And that alone doesn't provide all the money needed to maintain Smale, but it's a great shot in the arm to supplement the city budget. Thanks for the question, Jan.
Okay, and here's a final comment from Gerald Checo. The reason why parks have been great is not because of the commissioners, but because of a very talented and passionate staff.
I have to say, Gerald Checo did used to work for parks. Just wanted to point that out.
I think it's been some of both, actually. And for the most part, we're very fortunate to have the park system that we have. David, is there anything else that you want to say? Otherwise, I'll close our
no, just again, just to offer thanks to everybody, and thanks for coming, for all the comments. It's been very helpful, Frank and Steve. We learned an awful lot from your comments, and thank you for summarizing your work with us.
And yes,
you want to speak for just a moment, Beth, of where this might go from here?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I'm asking you.
Oh, where is this going? Where is this going? Okay, well, I have to mention, I have to apologize for the people, the 62 more comments and questions in the chat that we didn't get to. There's obviously a lot of interest in this. I encourage everybody to read the report. Women's City Club will send out a follow-up email giving anybody who registered a link to the recording of tonight's program. I mean, if there's interest, we could invite further discussion. We did that with a program that we had on the National Civic League report with recommendations on how to improve the relationship between the mayor, the council, and the city manager. And we are taking steps to fulfill some of those recommendations. So yeah, so that's possible that we could continue the discussion.
And we will be on, Frank and Alyssa and I will be on Cincinnati edition on Tuesday to continue the conversation. So.
Oh, there you go. So that's Cincinnati edition on WVXU next Tuesday at noon with Lucy May. All right, that is fantastic. And at this point, I'd also like to mention Women's Sea Club's next program, which will be on World Water Day, March 22nd, when we will present the water quality superintendent of the Greater Cincinnati Water Works, who will discuss how our water system copes with lead in our pipes, PFAS chemicals, and other threats. So we all drink water, so that should be important to all of us. So anyway, well, thank you all so much for tonight. It was a really good discussion, and I would like to see. Oh, here's one comment. A follow-up meeting and discussion would be great. Okay.